My Lords, I beg leave to ask a question as set out in the order paper, which I've given private notice. The question is to ask Her Majesty's Government, further to a fire at the tower block in Poplar, London, which left 2 people hospitalised and others injured, what plans they have to remove flammable cladding and ensure buildings are fire safe. I also draw the attention of the House to my relevant interests as set out in the Register.
I call the Minister, Lord Greenhalgh.
I'd like to express my deepest sympathies to the residents affected by the fire at New Providence Wharf and pay tribute to the swift response by the London Fire Brigade. We are providing an unprecedented £5.1 billion to fund the remediation of unsafe cladding, with expert support for those who need it. And New Providence Wharf itself has received £8 million.
My Lords, I join with the noble Lord in expressing my sympathy to the victims of the fire and expressing my thanks to the London Fire Brigade. The fire at the tower block in Poplar is another devastating reminder of the dangerous, stressful, worrying and wholly unacceptable situation thousands of people find themselves in today. Leaseholders and tenants, the innocent victims in a scandal that the Prime Minister promised they would not be picking up the bill for. So can the noble Lord Greenhalgh tell the House why is it that the Prime Minister's words, the Prime Minister's promises to the victims are so far removed from the reality and actions of the government? And when does he expect the government to start delivering on the repeated pledges and promises that the Prime Minister has made?
My Lords, first of all, I'd point out that 95% of buildings that were identified at the start of last year with the same cladding as on Grenfell Tower have either had the cladding removed or works have started to remove them. And we have made a great deal of progress in the last year with some 159 starts on site. And the Building Safety Fund is open and continues to approve a number of works that will ensure other forms of unsafe cladding are removed.
Pinnock.
That management companies for their blocks are refusing to sign up to a grant from the Building Safety Fund unless leaseholders also sign an agreement committing them to pay for all other remediation works. The consequence is that essential and urgent fire safety work is not being done. Leaseholders cannot commit to pay when they have no means to do so. How is the government intending to break this impasse in the interests of fire safety?
My Lords, you have to be clear that the agreement is with the building owner, not with individual leaseholders, and no leaseholder will be required to fund additional works as a condition of government funding for cladding remediation. Of course, where the building owners voluntarily decide to carry out works at the same time, then we do need assurances from them that this can be covered.
Lord Moynihan.
My Lords, can my noble friend the Minister inform the House whether there have been any engagement with Ballymore at official or ministerial level regarding the remediation of the ACM cladding prior to the fire at New Providence Wharf, given the vital importance of interaction between government and the housing sector on the urgent measures which require funding and implementation?
My Lords, I'd answer my noble friend. My department has been engaged with Ballymore for over 2 years to progress the work to remediate unsafe cladding. We also are paying for expert construction advice for this particular site, and that has been available since July 2020. And prior to the fire, and this year I had 2 meetings, so ministerially led meetings with the senior leadership of Ballymore and other members of London Government to try and get the work started. Sadly, they only started this Monday.
Lord Lowe of Dalston.
My Lords, I declare my interest as a lessee of a top floor flat in a 4-storey block. In February, the Prime Minister said that no leaseholder should have to pay for the unaffordable costs of fixing safety defects that they didn't cause and which are no fault of their own. The government has undertaken to indemnify those who live in blocks over 18 metres tall, but this leaves leaseholders who live in smaller blocks out in the cold. The government has offered loans to help them meet the cost, but they are no more at fault than those who lease flats in taller buildings and shouldn't have to pay either. Many can't afford to pay the interest, which merely saddles them with extra debt. What does the government intend to do to help them?
Well, my Lords, I've mentioned the unprecedented level of funding that has been put forward towards the remediation of cladding, but specifically the risks inherent in a medium-rise building is far lower than in a high-rise, some of which go well over 30 metres, and the higher the building, the greater the risk. But it is a significant commitment to ensure that leaseholders in these medium-rise buildings do not have to pay more than £50 per month in order to enable the remediation of the unsafe cladding on their buildings.
My Lords, the government has said it's not right for the taxpayer to bail out leaseholders, but taxpayers' money through the Building Safety Fund could be bailing out developers for building substandard developments. What plan does this government have to investigate whether developments met fire safety regulations at the time of construction, and in those cases where regulations were not met, to apportion remedial liability to the developers so that those responsible do actually pay?
My Lords, we've made it very much a condition of accessing any form of government funding that the building owners go through all the routes of redress in terms of looking at warranties and taking on areas where there's been poor construction practice to ensure that remediation costs are not passed on to leaseholders.
Lord Foulkes of Connaught.
The Minister's replies are entirely unsatisfactory. It's now nearly 4 years since 72 people died on the altar of private profit. And since then there have been 3 further instances in Barking, in Bolton, and this one in Poplar. And it's not just a matter of cladding over 16 metres, it's much more than that. When will the government fully fund all of the measures that are necessary to make these buildings safe before more lives are lost?
Well, my Lords, I note the point that's been made, but having said that, it is interesting to note that there are 2 authorities that are now still, 4 years after Grenfell, discovering the existence potentially of additional buildings with aluminium composite material. And the audit's been conducted by 2 authorities. Sheffield are looking at 9 buildings, and Tower Hamlets are looking at a further 6 buildings. You know, this discovery of ACM-cladded high-rises 4 years after Grenfell is also a matter that is, frankly, beyond the government's control.
Lord Taylor of Gosmoor.
The government says it's beyond the government's control, but of course safety is a matter for building regulations set by government and inspected by building regulators, and it is not the fault or responsibility of leaseholders. It's a great mistake to assume that because one fire was caused by cladding, there are not other issues that need remediation. Why is the government refusing support for those where the inspections now taking place show that the cavity blocks behind the insulation are the problem and not the insulation itself? So the same systems in place, a different fault, but a fault nonetheless, and yet they're being refused support.
My Lords, it's very clear from our independent expert advice that the greatest risk in terms of fire safety is the cladding system that accelerates the spread of fire. And it is clear that there are other defects, such as internal compartmentation, that are designed to stop the spread of fire. And so our focus is to remove the most risky element to ensure that we protect people's lives.
Lord Randall of Uxbridge.
My Lords, given that the original developer still owns and manages the building, what steps are being taken to ensure that the leaseholders are not being saddled with the historic building safety remediation costs that are no fault of their own?
My noble friend's right. We want to protect leaseholders, and we are funding £8 million. Our understanding is that the total remediation bill is some £12 million, and we've been pressing Ballymore to stump up the rest of the cash. When I initially met with them, they pledged £500,000. They've increased that this weekend to £1.5 million. Frankly, they shouldn't be passing on any costs to leaseholders.
Baroness Finlay of Llandaff.
Could the government explain why the principle of responsibility that would apply to cars and domestic appliances and so on, which may be dangerous and even kill people, where they're required to recall and remediate whatever the equipment is, does not seem to apply to the construction industry?
My Lords, I have to say, on taking over this particular ministerial brief, I was shocked at the weakness of the redress that's available to people who put all their life savings into a building. And that's something that we want to improve through the Building Safety Bill. We need to improve the ability to get redress for people that buy these properties and then discover these defects.
Lord Dobbs.
I'm not sure the Minister takes the urgency of the problem to heart. I've talked to people who are absolutely desperate. People who've told me that in their blocks there are people who are virtually suicidal because they can't afford to pay the cost of remediation and they can't afford to sell because their property is unsaleable. We have a major crisis on our hands. Surely we need much more urgent action than the Minister is saying the government is taking.
Well, my Lords, I meet very regularly with the cladding groups, and I do understand the need for urgency, and that is why we're moving very quickly to ensure that we dispense the first £1 billion of the Building Safety Fund, and why we pledged a further £3.5 billion. We do understand the need to get moving.
Of Knighton.
My Lords, I live very close to Grenfell, and I shall never forget that terrible night and the following day. And I think it's worth our pausing for one moment to pay tributes to the many people there who were affected. And in the spirit of that statement, could I ask the Minister whether he feels or whether the government has made an assessment as to whether there are buildings where safety procedures are being held up because of this problem with leaseholders?
Well, my Lords, all I can say is that we're making great progress in terms of dispensing our funding, and we continue to recognise the urgency of removing the unsafe cladding, and we've made a commitment where cost will not be a factor in removing them from high-rises.
Lord Berkeley.
Lords, does the Minister agree that it is the basic duty of government to protect its citizens from harm? And that includes having buildings and other regulations and the necessary means of enforcing them to deliver this. These are all within the government's control. My Lords, this debate on blame will go on for years, but now surely it's time that the government commit to funding all the works to replace all substandard and non-compliant materials and ensure that the owners, tenants and leaseholders are not asked to contribute.
You know, my Lords, we recognise the duty of government to do something about the regulatory system failure that we saw, but also the very poor practices that we've seen through the Grenfell inquiry from construction companies. And that's why we're bringing forward the Building Safety Bill to bring about a revolution in the way that we regulate higher risk buildings and establishing the Building Safety Regulator in statute. We've made it very clear our commitment by putting forward an unprecedented sum to ensure that remediation of unsafe cladding can be carried out.
My Lords, the Noble Lord Kennedy mentioned the fact that the Prime Minister has not honoured his promise so far on this issue. I would like to ask you, is there anybody in government or in the wider Conservative Party who can either make the Prime Minister honour his promises or stop him making any further false promises?
I certainly don't accept that personal attack on the Prime Minister. This is a Prime Minister that's committed an unprecedented sum of money. Let's remember that when I took office, only £600 million had been committed to the remediation of unsafe cladding, and then in the first budget in his time as Prime Minister, £1 billion was committed, and now a further £3.5 billion. This is a Prime Minister committed to ensure that the tragedy of Grenfell Tower never happens again.